I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. I picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road, because I wanted quiet. Real quiet, the kind you only get far from people and traffic. I packed light, just enough gear to last a couple of nights. My tent, sleeping bag, a little stove, and the basics. By the time I hiked in and found a clearing to set up, the late afternoon sun was filtering through the trees, painting everything with a golden haze. It felt perfect, exactly the kind of solitude I'd been craving. The forest had that heavy, still feeling to it, like it was holding its breath. I made camp near a small rise where I could see the surrounding trees more clearly. It wasn't wide open, but it gave me enough of a view to feel like I wasn't boxed in. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back as night settled in. The temperature dropped quickly, and the noises of the forest changed. The birds went quiet, replaced by insects and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. That night passed quietly, but I woke up at dawn the next morning to a cold, damp air that clung to my clothes. The fire was long dead, and everything around me looked muted in the gray light. I decided to stretch my legs before making coffee, so I wandered a little way from camp, following a faint trail that cut between tall trees. The forest was silent except for the crunch of my boots on the ground. About 20 minutes into the walk, I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just a faint crack of a twig or a shuffle through leaves. I froze and listened, waiting for it again. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or maybe even another deer, and I kept moving, though more slowly now. That's when it happened. A sudden, sharp blast of air came from just behind me. It was so loud and forceful that I nearly jumped out of my skin. It sounded like a violent cough or a sneeze, but deeper, wetter somehow, like it carried weight. The noise echoed through the trees, harsh and startling in the quiet morning. My first thought was that it was a person. The sound was so close to human that my chest locked up and my mind filled with panic. I spun around, heart hammering, half expecting to see someone standing there. But all I saw was a large shape slipping between the trees. A deer. Its tail flicked up, and then it was gone, moving fast but not crashing through the brush the way a spooked animal usually would. I stood there frozen, my breath catching in my throat. I realized what had happened. It had been a deer blowing. I'd heard of it before but never experienced it that close. The animal had sensed me, probably been watching me for longer than I'd known, and then let out that explosive sound to alert other deer in the area that something wasn't right. Still, knowing that didn't erase the way my body had reacted. For a few seconds, it had been pure fear, the kind that makes your stomach turn and your hands shake. I forced myself to calm down and listen to the forest around me. Everything was still, too still. After a blow like that, I realized the woods go quiet. It wasn't just one deer I'd startled. Now the whole area was on edge. I could feel it in the air, that heavy, uneasy silence that comes when every creature is paying attention. I decided to turn back to camp. My nerves were rattled, and I didn't like the feeling of being watched, even if it was only by animals. Every step back felt longer than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the trees. My brain wouldn't let go of that noise. It replayed in my head over and over again, that violent burst of air, almost human in its tone. When I finally made it back to camp, I sat down hard on the log near my fire pit, my hands still trembling. I got the stove going and made coffee just to have something warm to hold. I tried to steady my breathing, but my thoughts kept circling back. The scariest part wasn't the deer itself. It was how my brain had immediately assumed it was a person, someone close behind me in the woods. I hadn't seen the deer until after the noise, and for those few seconds, I was convinced I wasn't alone. That kind of realization sticks with you. The rest of the day, I stayed close to camp. I gathered firewood, cleaned up the area, and kept busy, but my senses were sharper than before. Every rustle made me jump, every bird call felt sharper. The deer's blow had flipped a switch in me, a reminder of how vulnerable I was out there. I thought about how easily fear creeps in when you're isolated, how quickly the mind fills in the blanks with the worst possibilities. That night, as I sat by the fire, the forest felt different. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, deeper, and the silence was heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, even though I knew logically it was just wildlife going about its business. I forced myself to finish out the trip, but I didn't wander far again. The sound of that blow was enough to keep me close, enough to remind me that I was a visitor in a place that wasn't mine. When I finally packed up and hiked out the next morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and respect. Relief to be leaving the tension of that campsite behind, but respect for how the forest had shown me its power. It didn't take a predator or a storm to scare me. It only took a deer, doing what deer do, to make me realize how small and exposed I really was. The ending of it all is simple. Nothing happened beyond that moment. No attack, no stranger in the woods, no disaster. I made it home safely, but the memory of that explosive sound, the way it cut the silence and froze me to the spot, stayed with me. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel my heart pick up, like my body remembers before my mind does. That's the truth of camping in the wild. Sometimes the scariest experiences aren't about life or death danger. They're about those brief, raw moments when the natural world reminds you how fragile you are, how little control you actually have. That deer was just warning others, but to me, in that instant, it was pure horror. It's a sound I'll never forget, and a reminder that in the woods, even something as ordinary as a deer can turn a peaceful morning into a moment of fear that stays with you long after you leave. The first night of that camping trip had been rough. I had set up camp in a patch of woods not far from a lake, figuring it would be quiet, peaceful, and a good spot to spend a couple of days away from everything. But even though I had gone deep enough into the trees that I couldn't see or hear any roads, I barely slept. The forest is never silent, not really, and when you're lying in a thin nylon tent in the middle of it, every sound gets amplified. The snap of a branch, the shuffle of something moving through leaves, the call of some bird you don't recognize. All of it comes through in waves. By the time morning came, I felt like I'd only managed an hour or two of actual sleep. My eyes were gritty, my mouth was dry, and my body felt stiff. The light had already started breaking through the tree canopy, and I could see the shadows moving as the wind stirred the branches above. For a while, I just lay there inside the tent, staring at the orange glow of the fabric around me, debating whether or not to get up. That's when I noticed it. Not a sound, but a sensation. At first, I brushed it off as nothing unusual. I was a guy, after all, and waking up in the woods or not, sometimes the body does its own thing. But the way it pressed against the fabric of the sleeping bag made me pause. It wasn't just me shifting around. Felt off somehow. Stiffer, heavier. I sat up, groggy, unzipping the bag to get more comfortable. The movement of the zipper broke the silence inside the tent, and right then, I heard it. A loud, sharp crack. Not a twig under a rabbit's foot, but something bigger, heavier, something that had weight. I froze in place, my hands still on the zipper. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. A long groaning creak, like old wood straining under pressure. Then another loud snap. At first, I thought it might be a branch in the wind, maybe something up in the canopy shifting. But as I sat there, the sound kept building. It wasn't random anymore. It had rhythm. It was a slow, steady cracking, followed by deep thuds, as if something massive was being pressed against, bent to its breaking point. That's when it hit me. It wasn't my body giving me the morning jolt. It was the trees, the wood. A gust of wind passed over the tent, and I felt a vibration ripple through the ground. The sound that followed was deafening. A massive splintering snap, followed by a crash that seemed to shake the earth itself. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and fumbled with the zipper of the tent door. By the time I got it open, the noise was still echoing through the woods. I stumbled out barefoot, adrenaline firing through me, and saw it. A massive tree had fallen not 30 feet from where I had set up camp. The trunk had shattered into jagged pieces where it hit the ground. Branches sprawled out like broken limbs across the forest floor. It looked like it had been dead for a while, rotting from the inside, just waiting for the right push from the wind to bring it down. I stood there, chest heaving, looking at the mess. It wasn't just one tree. Around me, other trunks groaned as the wind picked up again. Some of them leaned at odd angles, their roots half exposed from years of erosion. The whole area where I'd chosen to camp was littered with widowmakers, dead branches and half-rotted trees waiting for the right moment to drop. The thought made my stomach twist. I realized that while I had been lying there inside my tent, debating whether to crawl out of my sleeping bag, one of those trunks had been giving way. And if the wind had shifted just a little differently, if I had set up camp 10 feet in another direction, that tree might not have fallen harmlessly beside me. It could have crushed me in my sleep, no chance to react, no chance to move. I walked closer to the fallen trunk, careful not to get too close to the tangle of branches. The air was sharp with the smell of freshly split wood, and the ground was littered with bark and splinters. I placed my hand on the rough surface of the trunk and felt the moisture seeping from the exposed core. Rotten on the inside, solid looking on the outside. You wouldn't know just by looking at it how unstable it had been. The realization left me cold. I thought about how many campers had probably pitched tents under trees just like that, not realizing the danger until it was too late. It was morning wood, all right, not the kind that makes you laugh, but the kind that kills. I backed away from the wreckage and looked at my tent. It was still standing, flimsy and bright against the dark trees. For the first time since setting it up, I saw just how vulnerable it really was. Nothing but fabric between me and a falling trunk. Nothing but luck between life and being crushed flat. I didn't even make coffee that morning. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving gear into my bag without much thought for order. The whole time, my ears stayed tuned to the woods around me, listening for the next groan, the next crack. Every gust of wind sent a fresh wave of panic through me. By the time I started hiking out, my nerves were shot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting another tree to come crashing down behind me. My pace was quick, almost frantic, and I didn't slow down until I was back at the trailhead, standing next to my car, my legs shaking from both fear and exhaustion. The rest of the drive home, I kept replaying it in my mind. The sound of the wood splintering, the vibration in the ground, the sheer violence of that tree hitting earth. It wasn't something you could ignore once you'd seen it. And the scariest part wasn't the noise or even the sight of it. It was the timing. How close I had been without realizing it. That morning taught me more about camping than any book or guide ever could. I realized that setting up in a pretty clearing isn't enough. You have to look up, check the trees, make sure you're not under something dead or leaning. Because in the woods, morning wood isn't a joke. It's a warning. It's the reminder that the forest doesn't care if you're there or not. Things fall when they're ready, and you just hope you're not in the way. Even now, when I set up camp, I can't shake the habit. I scan the trees, study the branches, and choose my spot with care. That single morning, the near miss with that falling trunk, stays with me. Could have been the last thing I ever experienced. All because I thought I'd found the perfect campsite without looking twice. The ending was simple. I got lucky. The tree missed me. But luck isn't something I like to count on anymore. The woods have their own rules, and that morning, I learned one of the harshest. Never ignore the wood around you. Can take you down in an instant. I was a kid in the mid-90s, living out in the rural edge of town where the woods stretched for miles. The kind of woods that felt endless when you were small, full of creeks, brambles, old logging roads, and places parents always warned you not to wander too far into. But we were kids, and kids never listened. My friends and I would spend whole days out there, exploring, building forts, trying to spook each other, convinced we were discovering things no one else had seen in years. That was the backdrop for the day we stumbled onto the strangest, most unsettling thing I've ever seen in my life. An abandoned farmhouse, left exactly as it was in the 1950s, as if the people who had lived there had vanished in the middle of a normal afternoon. We had been hiking for hours already, crossing into Weyerhaeuser timber property. Back then, the company owned huge swaths of the forest, with old roads cut through for trucks and machinery. The place was big enough to get lost in if you didn't keep track, and we rarely paid attention to anything but what was right in front of us. That day, we followed a little trail that curved off behind a ridge and dropped down into a clearing none of us remembered seeing before. That's when we saw the house. It was sitting back in a field, partially hidden behind tall grass and blackberry vines. The roof lines stuck out first, gray shingles curling and moss creeping across them. The place looked worn but intact, not like the rotting shells of barns we sometimes found. As we pushed through the brush and stepped into the clearing, the full shape of the farmhouse appeared. 2 stories, faded white paint, a sagging porch with a swing hanging on one side. It didn't look vandalized, not spray painted or broken apart like you'd expect from kids stumbling on it over the years. It looked like no one had touched it. We dared each other to go up first, and eventually we all crept onto the porch together. The boards creaked but held our weight. The front door wasn't locked. I remember pushing it open and smelling the stale, trapped air, heavy with dust and something faintly sour, like old wood and food long past rotten. The living room looked like a family had just stepped out and never came back. There was furniture still in place, an armchair, a couch with worn cushions. On the coffee table sat a neat stack of magazines and unopened envelopes. We picked one up and saw the postmark, sometime in the mid-1950s. Every magazine in that pile had the same year stamped on it, as if time had stopped in that exact moment. The more we explored, the stranger it got. Beds upstairs still had sheets and blankets on them, yellowed with age but untouched. Clothes were folded in drawers, hanging in closets. The kitchen pantry was full of jars and cans, some intact, others split open and leaking dark, sticky messes that had long since dried. The sink held a few dishes. The table had plates set out, as if a meal had been interrupted. There were even candles sitting in holders on the counter, unburned, waiting to be lit. The strangest part wasn't just that everything was still there. It was that it was all untouched. No broken windows, no graffiti, no beer cans left behind by trespassers. We were the first to set foot inside in 40 years, and the silence in that house pressed down on us, heavier than the dust. When we stepped outside again, we started checking the farm. That's when the unease turned into something closer to dread. The chicken coop was the first stop. Inside were the skeletons of dozens of birds. Some were still wrapped in dried, papery skin, others just bare bones scattered across the dirt floor. It wasn't like a predator had gotten in. The wire was intact. It was like they had all just starved or been left without anyone to care for them. The pig pen was worse. 2 skeletons lay side by side, their bones bleached from years of sun and weather. Out in the pasture, we found the remains of larger animals. A horse collapsed near a fence line, cows scattered across the field, their rib cages stark against the ground. The longer we looked, the more it became clear. Every animal had been left to die. In the garage, a tractor sat parked. Its paint was faded, but it looked remarkably preserved, as if it could have been started up with the right touch. No rust eating through it, no obvious damage. Just sitting there, waiting. We wandered the property in silence after that. Even as kids, we understood how strange it all was. A whole farm, abandoned in an instant, left to decay, and no one had come to strip it, break it, or even disturb it. I remember standing on the porch again before we left, staring back inside. The stillness of that living room, the mail frozen in time, the dishes waiting to be washed. It left a mark on me. The thought that people had once lived here, cooked meals, fed animals, laughed in these rooms, and then suddenly nothing. No gradual decline, no signs of moving away, just a complete stop. We eventually made our way home, our voices low, none of us cracking the usual jokes or dares. Even as kids, the weight of it followed us. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Lying in bed at night, I'd picture those chicken skeletons, the horse collapsed in the field, the untouched letters waiting for someone who never came back to read them. As I got older, the memory didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier. I realized what we had seen wasn't just some spooky old house. It was a mystery. Why had they left? Where had they gone? Why was there no sign of anyone returning to claim a thing, not even a family member? And how had that entire farm remained so untouched for 4 decades? The strangest thing is how ordinary it looked at first. It wasn't ruined, wasn't haunting in a traditional way. But that's what made it worse. It was real, completely real, with every detail preserved. Like time had been paused and nature had only done part of its work. I never went back there. None of us did. Life moved on. But that farmhouse never left me. I think about it sometimes when I'm camping, staring at the quiet woods around me, the stillness of nature pressing in. I remember that porch, that room frozen in 1955, those animals left behind. And I realized the scariest part wasn't the skeletons or the dust. It was the silence. The fact that a whole family could vanish, a whole farm could be abandoned, and no one ever seemed to notice. No answers, no explanations, just a ghost of everyday life left to rot in the woods. Even now, decades later, when I walk into the forest, I catch myself scanning through the trees, half expecting to see that clearing again. The thought of stumbling onto it as an adult chills me more than it did back then. Because as a kid, it was just a mystery. But now I understand the weight of it. Now I know how terrifying it is to see a life interrupted so completely, without reason, without closure, and to realize that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or shadows. They're the unanswered questions that time itself leaves behind. I remember the day clearly because it started out so normal. My cousin and I weren't planning to hike or camp anywhere special. We were just kids with nothing better to do, wandering the woods near my home like we always did. Back then, the woods stretched out for miles behind our little town, and the dirt roads, half-forgotten trails, and logging paths all blurred together into one big playground. We'd walk for hours just exploring, not really thinking about where we were going, just following whatever path looked the most interesting. That's how we found it, the trailer. We had walked maybe a mile down an old dirt road that was mostly overgrown. The road had been wide once, probably for trucks, but now saplings were sprouting up in the middle and thorn bushes clawed at our legs. Eventually, we spotted a narrow trail cutting off to the side. At first it didn't look like much, just a faint gap in the trees. But when we followed it, we realized it had once been a driveway. Grass had taken over, weeds grew high, but the outline of where tires had worn the ground was still visible. We pushed forward, curious, and after maybe 100 yards, the trees opened up just enough for us to see it. A trailer home sitting there in silence. It looked abandoned but not collapsed, just frozen in time. The siding was dirty and streaked, windows fogged with grime. The small porch sagged a little, and vines had started to crawl up the corners. The strangest thing was how ordinary it looked, like someone could have lived there yesterday, but also how wrong it felt sitting there, completely cut off with the woods swallowing it up. Of course, we had to look closer. Kids never think twice about that kind of thing. We were too curious to turn around. We walked up slowly, half expecting someone to come out, but the closer we got, the clearer it became that no one had been there in a very long time. The front door wasn't locked. Stuck when we tried it, but a hard shove made it creak open. The smell that hit us first was thick and stale, the kind of air that had been trapped for decades. It smelled of old paper, dust, and something faintly rotten, like food left too long. Inside, the scene made my skin crawl even as a kid. It wasn't wrecked or vandalized. There were no signs anyone had broken in, no graffiti, no beer cans or bottles. It looked like whoever had lived there had just stepped out one day and never returned. Unopened mail sat piled on a counter. We flipped through a few envelopes and saw dates from the early 1980s. On a small table, there were checks written out but never sent, still sitting in neat stacks. Photographs hung on the wall in simple frames. Smiling family portraits, kids in school clothes, parents at some holiday gathering. The colors had faded, but the faces stared back at us from another time. In the bedroom, clothes hung in the closets, shoes lined up neatly on the floor. Drawers still had folded shirts, socks, things no one had touched in years. The beds had sheets and blankets, faded but still tucked in like they'd been waiting. The kitchen was the eeriest part. Dishes sat in the sink, a pan on the stove, like someone had been cooking when the world just stopped. The fridge had long since rotted away inside, its door hanging slightly open, a dark stain underneath where whatever was once inside had leaked out decades earlier. The whole place had a stillness that didn't feel right. It wasn't just abandoned, it was undisturbed. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had stripped it for parts or gone through the drawers. Nobody had broken a window. It was like it had been sealed away and forgotten. Right there in the woods, left to sink into time. After exploring the rooms in silence, we stepped back outside. The clearing around the trailer had almost closed in, weeds choking the old driveway, trees leaning closer year by year. It felt cut off from the world, hidden. What stuck with me most, though, was how complete it had been inside. A life frozen mid-step, checks waiting to be mailed, pictures on the wall, clothes ready to be worn. It was like a family had walked out for work one morning and never returned. Later on, we tried asking around town. It's a small place where everybody knows everybody, but when we mentioned the trailer, no one seemed to know who had lived there or what had happened. A few older folks just shrugged, said they didn't remember. For a place like ours, where people's lives were always intertwined, it didn't make sense that nobody had any answers. For years after, the memory of that trailer stayed sharp in my mind. Sometimes I'd picture those envelopes stacked neatly, waiting for hands that never came back to touch them. Sometimes I'd see the shoes lined up in the closet, like their owner would slip them on any minute. Even now, as an adult, I think back on it and realize how unsettling it really was. Not because it was haunted or anything like that, but because it was so real. It was a home, someone's life, left exactly where it ended. No explanation, no trace of what happened to them. Just a shell, hidden in the woods, with time stopped inside. When I go camping now, I sometimes find myself staring at the tree lines at night, wondering how many other places like that are out there. Homes swallowed by the forest, lives erased but not forgotten, waiting quietly for someone to stumble across them. And the scariest part isn't what we saw inside the trailer. It's the silence around it, the way nobody in our town remembered, the way there was no record, no story passed down, just emptiness where a whole family's history should have been. That's what lingers, the unanswered questions. The thought that sometimes people vanish, not in big, dramatic ways, but quietly, without leaving a mark. And one day you walk down an overgrown driveway and find the evidence, waiting in the woods, as if the past had been holding its breath all along. I've spent plenty of nights camping, enough to get comfortable with the usual noises and worries that come with being out in the woods. Most of the time, the only things that ever unsettled me were the sounds of animals moving nearby or the occasional crack of a branch that carried too much weight to ignore. But there was one trip I'll never forget because it left me thinking about something much darker than animals or storms. It made me realize how people can leave their traces in places you'd never expect, and how careless or twisted someone could be with the evidence of a crime. It was late summer, warm days but cool nights, the kind where sitting by a campfire feels perfect. I'd picked a spot a couple hours outside of town, down an old trail that barely saw use anymore. The campsite was simple, just a clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall pines and underbrush. I set up my tent, got the fire going, and figured I'd have a quiet weekend to myself. The first night passed without much issue, though I kept waking up at odd hours, listening to noises in the brush. The second day, while exploring farther out, I stumbled onto something strange. I was following the stream downstream, watching for trout in the deeper pools, when I noticed a patch of ground that didn't look natural. The dirt had been disturbed, packed down but uneven, with weeds growing differently than the rest of the bank. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been digging there, but then I saw something shiny sticking up. It was a metal button. When I pulled it free, I realized it was still attached to a small piece of fabric, badly decayed, but clearly once part of clothing. I stared at it for a long time before putting it back down and brushing sand over it. My stomach felt heavy. That discovery alone would have been enough to put me on edge, but it didn't stop there. Later that same day, while cutting through a patch of trees on my way back to camp, I found another spot that made me freeze. It was maybe half a mile away from the stream, just off the deer path I'd been walking. The ground there had been disturbed too, though in a different way. Someone had tried to cover something up with branches and pine needles. Curious but unsettled, I moved a few aside and saw what looked like the rusted frame of a belt buckle, half buried in the dirt. Next to it were fragments of what I thought were old shoes, rotten leather barely holding together. My mind immediately went back to the button I'd found earlier, and the thought came to me uninvited. What were the odds of finding two separate spots like that, both with signs of belongings buried in shallow dirt? That night, I couldn't shake the thought. Lying in my tent, I kept staring at the nylon walls, listening for footsteps outside, convinced I had somehow stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. I thought about crime shows I'd seen, where people tried to hide evidence of murders by scattering remains or objects in multiple places. The logic seemed flawed to me. Wouldn't spreading things around increase the chance of someone eventually finding one of the pieces? If everything was in one spot, at least it might stay hidden longer. But if you cut it all up, bury it here and there, eventually the forest shifts, storms wash things out, animals dig, hikers pass by. Someone sees. Someone like me. By the third morning, my curiosity had overtaken my fear. I decided to look more carefully. I walked farther in the opposite direction from camp and, almost unbelievably, I found a third disturbed patch of ground. This one was older, overgrown, covered in moss and roots. But when I poked at the soil with a stick, I turned up a shard of glass, maybe from a bottle or jar, and what looked like a zipper. That was when it really hit me. This wasn't random trash. This was deliberate. Someone, years ago maybe, had tried to scatter items across the woods, burying them just deep enough to be hidden for a while, but not deep enough to last forever. I spent the rest of that day restless, my nerves frayed. Every sound in the woods made me jump. A squirrel cracking twigs in the brush made me think someone was moving closer. A gust of wind bending the trees felt like a warning. I kept picturing someone out there, watching me, realizing that I had started uncovering what they left behind. That night was the worst of it. I couldn't relax by the fire, couldn't close my eyes in the tent. My head was full of questions. Who had done this? How many spots were there? What exactly had I found? Clothing? Personal items? Or something worse that I just hadn't dug deep enough to uncover? Most of all, why scatter it across the woods? The fear of being in the middle of it, surrounded by these hidden pieces, made me feel trapped. I couldn't even pack up in the dark, because the thought of walking through those same woods at night was worse than staying put. I ended up sitting awake most of the night, waiting for daylight. When morning came, I broke camp quickly and hiked out without looking back. Every snapping twig put my heart in my throat. Every shadow between the trees felt wrong. I didn't feel safe until I reached my truck and locked the doors. I told myself I should report what I found, but part of me hesitated. Maybe they were just old belongings, dumped by someone decades ago. Maybe I was letting my imagination run too far. Still, the unease clung to me. I did eventually mention it to someone I trusted, but I left out details about the exact location. Even now, years later, I think about it often. The way the items were spread out almost like a trail. The way the woods seemed too quiet once I realized what I'd stumbled into. And the question that won't leave my head. If the person who scattered those things wanted them hidden, then why scatter them at all? The only answer I can think of is this. Maybe they thought that by spreading them out, no one would ever connect the dots. That each piece on its own would look like nothing more than lost trash or forgotten junk. But standing there in the woods, realizing I had found more than one, I connected them. And once I did, the forest didn't feel like a safe place anymore. It felt like I had walked straight into the shadow of something awful that someone else had tried to bury. I left those woods with a different kind of fear that hasn't really gone away. Not fear of animals or storms or being lost. Fear of people and what they're capable of hiding. And how sometimes the truth isn't buried in one place, but scattered all around you, waiting for someone unlucky enough to notice. I've always gone camping to clear my head. The quiet woods, the smell of pine, the sound of water running over rocks. It's the kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. But one trip in particular changed the way I look at the woods forever. It was supposed to be nothing more than a weekend away, but instead it turned into something that has stayed with me for years. It started off normal enough. I picked a spot not far from a lake, an old campground that hardly anyone used anymore. The place had been run down for years, But I liked that. It meant no noisy groups, no one walking past my tent in the middle of the night, no dogs barking or car doors slamming. I pitched my tent near the tree line, gathered some firewood, and spent the first day just hiking around, enjoying the stillness. The second day, though, I wandered farther than I normally would. I followed a narrow path that was barely visible, more of an animal trail than anything people had made. It twisted through the woods, dipping down into a shallow valley before climbing back up toward a rocky ridge. As I pushed through the brush, I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the trail, maybe 20 or 30 feet in, there was an old refrigerator sitting in the woods. It was one of those old models, big and square, the kind with a heavy door and rounded edges. It looked completely out of place, sitting crooked in a patch of weeds and saplings. At first I thought it might have been dumped there decades ago, forgotten and rusting away. The white paint had peeled into patches of brown and orange, and the handle was covered in grime. But what made me stop in my tracks was the smell. Even from where I stood, I caught it. That sour, rotten stench that doesn't belong in clean air. It made my stomach turn instantly, and I knew it wasn't just some food scraps left behind. It was heavier, sharper, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. I'd smelled dead animals before on hikes, when something had crawled off into the brush and decayed. But this was worse. I wanted to ignore it, just turn back and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity has a way of getting its hooks in. I walked closer, covering my mouth with my sleeve. The closer I got, the more overpowering the smell became. When I reached the fridge, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It hung slightly ajar, like something had been stuffed inside and kept it from sealing. I didn't want to open it, but I did. I used a stick to pry the door wider. Inside was a mess of dark stains and something wrapped in old, filthy sheets. The smell hit me so hard I nearly vomited right there. I dropped the stick and stumbled back, gagging, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to look any closer. My mind made the connection before I even realized it. A few months earlier, there had been a murder in the city nearby. It was all over the local news for weeks. A man had gone missing, and when they eventually arrested the suspect, the police said he'd tried to hide the body in his refrigerator at home. But the smell had given him away almost immediately, and neighbors had called the authorities. I remember the reporters talking about it in disbelief, about how careless and desperate it was. Standing there in the woods, looking at that rusted fridge with its contents still inside, everything clicked. I realized I wasn't just staring at some old junk someone dumped in the woods. I was looking at what had been left behind after the arrest. Maybe the police had taken what they needed from the house, but someone had to get rid of what was left. Or maybe the suspect had dragged it out here himself before he was caught. The sheets inside had shifted just enough that I could see what was tucked against the back. A shape I recognized instantly even though I wished I hadn't. The curve of a human skull. The jaw was gone, but the rest was there, yellowed and stained. I froze. My body went cold all over. It was one thing to hear about a murder on the news, but it was another thing entirely to stumble across the evidence with your own eyes. It felt like the forest around me had changed in that moment. The trees didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt like they were closing in, heavy and oppressive. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound even though I was alone. My mind kept spinning with possibilities. What if whoever had put it there was still around? What if I was being watched right then? The smell was strong enough to carry a ways, and if I had noticed it, anyone else could too. I hurried back to my campsite, but the calm I'd felt before was gone. Every sound set me on edge, the snapping of branches, the rush of wind through the leaves, even the crackle of my own fire. I couldn't stop replaying the image of that skull in my head, the way it had been hidden but not hidden enough. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept sitting up in my tent, straining my ears, gripping the handle of my pocket knife even though I knew it wouldn't help against the kind of person who could do something like that. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of hiking through the woods in the dark was worse than staying put. As soon as the sun rose, I tore down my tent and stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted out. The hike back to my car felt longer than it had coming in. My back ached from the weight of my pack, but I pushed myself, moving fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When I finally reached the gravel road where I had parked, I felt a wave of relief, but it was mixed with something heavier. The woods weren't just woods anymore. They were a place where something horrific had been left to rot. A place where someone had tried to erase their crime but failed. I reported what I found later, after I had time to calm down. I didn't go back with anyone, though. I couldn't bring myself to walk that trail again. I left it in the hands of people who were trained to deal with it, people who wouldn't lose sleep every time they thought about it. But I do. I still think about it often, especially when I see an old fridge sitting out by the road, waiting to be hauled away. I think about how desperate and sloppy someone had to be, how the smell gave them away both in their home and in the woods. And most of all, I think about how close I came to walking right past it, never knowing what was inside. That trip ruined camping for me in a way. I still go sometimes, but I don't wander as far, and I never look at abandoned things the same way again. Because I know now that sometimes what you find out there isn't just trash or old junk. Sometimes it's a piece of something terrible, left behind for someone else to stumble across. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The woods never feel the same after that. Camping was always a way for me to escape from everything. I liked being far away from traffic, people, and noise. Just me, the woods, a tent, and enough food to last a couple of nights. I'd always felt like the forest had its own kind of silence, a silence that felt alive, heavy but comforting. But one trip burned that comfort out of me for good, and it had everything to do with what I stumbled onto in those woods. It was late summer, one of those weekends where the heat breaks just enough in the evenings to make it bearable to sleep outside. I had driven out to a spot I'd used before, not far from a creek that wound through a valley thick with pine and alder. The place was old logging land, mostly forgotten except by hunters in the fall. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Quiet, overgrown, and empty. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and settled into that easy rhythm that comes with camping. By the second day, I decided to wander farther from camp than usual. I like to hike without a real path, just following animal trails and natural clearings, seeing where I ended up. Sometimes I'd find old bottles, rusted tools, or bits of barbed wire from when the land had been fenced. That day, though, I found something that didn't feel like it belonged at all. About a mile from camp, I came across an old freezer half buried in weeds and brush. It was one of those chest freezers, wide and low to the ground, its lid spotted with rust and leaves. It looked like it had been there a long time. At first, I thought it was just another piece of junk someone had dumped in the woods years ago, like I'd seen before. But as I got closer, I noticed the way the ground around it was disturbed. The dirt had been turned up, patches of grass still missing. It was like someone had dragged it there recently, even though the freezer itself looked ancient. I probably should have walked away right then, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I pushed aside some branches and studied it. The lid was slightly cracked open. A smell seeped out. A smell I knew right away wasn't just old food. It was heavier, sour, the kind of smell that makes the back of your throat sting. I nudged the lid with a stick, and the hinge creaked as it opened wider. Inside, stacked haphazardly, were shapes wrapped in black plastic. The bags were tied off with duct tape, but some had split open, and what was inside spilled out just enough to be seen. I didn't need much. What I saw was pale and bloated, with the unmistakable curve of a hand pressed against the plastic. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled back, gagging from both the stench and the shock. It didn't take long for my brain to put it together. This wasn't garbage, and it wasn't an animal. Someone had been cut apart, stuffed into pieces, and crammed into that freezer. 6 bags, 6 pieces. It echoed something I'd once heard in a news story about how killers sometimes tried to store bodies like leftovers. But no matter how they tried to hide it, the smell always gave them away. My skin prickled all over. It wasn't just what was in the freezer that terrified me. It was the realization that someone had brought it here, to these woods, not far from where I had pitched my tent. Whoever did this had chosen this spot because it was remote, forgotten. And if I had found it, then maybe I wasn't as alone out here as I thought. I backed away slowly, every sense sharpened, listening for the crack of a branch, a shift of leaves, anything that might mean I wasn't alone. The woods felt different now. They didn't feel safe or calm. They felt like they were holding something dark, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I forced myself to head back toward camp, but I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had left the freezer might still be nearby. Maybe they came back to check on it. Maybe they were watching it even now. Every rustle in the brush made me flinch. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone waiting. When I finally reached my camp, I didn't waste time. I stuffed everything into my pack, yanked my tent stakes out of the ground, and shoved the crumpled tent into the bag. My hands were shaking so badly it was hard to work the straps, but I got it all together and started back toward the dirt road where I had left my car. The whole hike out, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. My ears caught every noise, from the call of a bird to the snap of twigs under deer hooves. My chest felt tight, and my legs burned from moving faster than I ever had with a pack. The freezer was burned into my mind. Those bags, that smell, the way it had been left there, as if waiting for someone like me to find it. When I finally broke out of the trees and saw my car, relief washed over me, but it was cut by a sick dread that lingered in my gut. I tossed my gear in the back seat and drove until the woods thinned out, the road smoothed, and I could see power lines and houses again. Only then did I let myself breathe properly. Later, when I was home, I called it in. I gave the location as best I could, told them what I'd found. They didn't tell me much in return, just that they'd send someone to check. I never went back to see what became of it, never asked for updates. I didn't want to know more than I already did. What sticks with me the most, even years later, is the thought behind it. Cutting someone into 6 pieces, stuffing them into bags, trying to stash them away like leftovers in a freezer. It wasn't just brutal, it was careless. And when the freezer started to smell, instead of facing it, they dragged it out into the woods and left it for someone else to stumble across. That someone ended up being me. Camping hasn't been the same since. I still go sometimes, but I stay closer to trails now, closer to people. Because I know the truth of it. The woods are full of things people want to hide. Old junk, broken tools, trash. But sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's something that carries a story too dark to tell, left in the quiet where no one is supposed to look. And once you've seen that kind of thing, once you've smelled it, once you've stood there staring at proof of what people are capable of, you can't ever go back to thinking the woods are just peaceful. You know better. You know what can be waiting, silent and rotting, just a few steps off the trail. When I go camping, I usually keep my food simple. I don't bother with big meals or anything that takes a long time. Most of the time it's instant oatmeal, trail mix, jerky, or a can of beans heated up over a little stove. But that weekend, I remember I had packed tortillas, some shredded cheese in a cooler with ice, and a small pan. I had this dumb thought in my head the whole drive out. Make yourself a dang quesadilla. It was a joke I'd said to myself, something simple to look forward to, a bit of comfort food out in the woods. I didn't think much of it then, but later, that little meal was tied to one of the scariest experiences I've ever had outdoors. The spot I picked was deep in the forest, away from campsites and people. I followed an old logging road that had long since grown over, parked my car at the edge, and hiked in a couple of miles until the sound of the highway was gone. The ground was soft from recent rain, but not muddy, and the trees were thick enough that I felt completely hidden. I set up my tent in a clearing near a slope that dropped toward a stream. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine needles, and I felt like I had found a perfect spot to disappear into for a couple of nights. By the time I got everything set up, the sun was dipping low, filtering orange light through the trees. My stomach growled, and I decided it was finally time to make that quesadilla I'd been thinking about. I set up my little stove, pulled out the pan, tossed on a tortilla, sprinkled some cheese, and folded it over. The smell of toasting tortilla and melting cheese hit me right away. It was nothing fancy, but in the middle of the woods it felt like a feast. I ate slowly, sitting on a log, enjoying the quiet. That's when I noticed it. The woods were almost too quiet. Usually at that time of day, I'd hear birds settling in for the night, or the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing, just stillness. broken only by the faint crackle of my stove. First, I brushed it off. Sometimes the forest just goes still. But as I chewed, I felt this prickling on the back of my neck, that weird pressure you get when you feel like you're being watched. I glanced around, scanning the treeline. Nothing moved, nothing obvious. I told myself I was just spooking myself for no reason. Then I heard it, a sharp crunch of leaves uphill behind my tent. Not the scurrying of a squirrel, but the weight of something heavy stepping once and then stopping. My stomach dropped, and the half-eaten quesadilla suddenly felt like a rock in my throat. I set down the pan slowly, trying not to make a sound, and strained to listen. For a long stretch, there was nothing. Then another step, deliberate, closer. Every part of me screamed to run, but I forced myself to stay still. If it was a deer, bolting would just startle it. If it wasn't, well, I didn't know. My eyes darted to my hatchet, leaning against the log a couple of feet away, but I didn't reach for it yet. The air grew colder, or maybe it just felt that way because of the adrenaline flooding me. I waited, heart pounding so hard it seemed louder than the forest itself. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Whoever or whatever was moving had gone still. I stayed frozen until my legs ached from not moving. Finally, I forced myself to move toward the tent, my ears tuned to every sound. I tossed the pan back into my pack, doused the little stove, and grabbed the hatchet. The rest of my gear stayed scattered. I didn't care. I just wanted out. As I slung my pack over one shoulder, I heard another sound, this one different. A sharp exhale, like air being blown forcefully through the nose. It was close, just beyond the trees. It was a sound I'd only ever heard once before while hunting, the blowing of a deer. But it didn't comfort me. If it was blowing, it meant it was alarmed. It had sensed something, and that something wasn't me. I didn't wait to figure it out. I grabbed my flashlight, even though there was still some daylight left, and started down the slope toward the stream. Moving downhill was faster, and I wanted the water as a guide. My boots slipped on wet leaves, my pack bounced against me. But I didn't stop until I reached the bottom where the stream gurgled softly between rocks. I crouched there, breathing hard, watching the slope above me. The woods stayed silent, too silent. No footsteps followed, no snapping branches. But I couldn't shake the image of something standing up there, watching me crouched in the shadows. I made a choice then. I wasn't staying the night. I followed the stream until it bent toward the direction of the road, keeping my pace steady, flashlight ready though I barely used it. Every noise, every flicker of movement in the trees sent a jolt through me. I half expected to see someone or something step out at any moment. By the time I found the old logging road again, dusk had turned to full dark. My legs ached, and my nerves were shot. But when I finally saw the outline of my car through the trees, I felt like I'd stepped back into the world of the living. I threw my pack in, climbed behind the wheel, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I drove until I hit the highway, the dark forest stretching out behind me. My mind replayed every sound, every step, every second of silence. I never saw who or what it was. Maybe it really was just a deer, spooked by my cooking. Maybe it was something bigger, a predator moving through. Or maybe it was a person, someone out there for reasons I don't even want to imagine. What stuck with me most wasn't even the sound itself. It was that silence before it. The way the woods seemed to shut down, as if everything living had decided to stay quiet, to hold its breath, because something wrong was near. When I finally got home, I unpacked my gear in the kitchen. The tortillas were still there, half the cheese still wrapped in the cooler. I picked it up, stared at it, and felt my stomach twist. That little comfort meal I had looked forward to had been cut off halfway through, left unfinished because something else had claimed the woods around me. To this day, I can't make a quesadilla on a camping trip without thinking about that night. The silence, the footsteps, the blowing sound in the trees. Every time I hear a crunch in the woods now, I think about how quickly things can shift from peaceful to dangerous, how fast comfort can turn into fear. That trip reminded me that when you're out there, it doesn't take much for the forest to remind you who really belongs. And sometimes, no matter how much you try to convince yourself otherwise, you're not alone out there. Not at all. When I think back on that camping trip, it still unsettles me how something so harmless could spiral into something that made my skin crawl for days afterward. It all started as nothing more than a simple weekend trip to get away from the noise of town. I wanted a quiet break, just a few days out in the woods where I could sit by a fire, listen to the trees creak in the wind, and maybe cook some food over the coals. I packed light: a small tent, my sleeping bag, a single burner stove, a cooler with some food, and a couple of odds and ends. I wasn't planning anything extreme, just a calm, simple couple of nights outdoors. The first night went as planned. I hiked a few miles off the road and set up camp near a patch of pines that gave me shelter from the wind. It wasn't the most scenic spot, but it felt private, and privacy was what I wanted. After a meal and some time staring into the flames, I settled into my sleeping bag. The forest was silent, aside from the faint rustle of branches and an occasional crack far off, probably a deer or a raccoon. The next morning, I woke early. The air was damp, and the ground was cold under my boots when I climbed out of the tent. I boiled some water for coffee and started planning what to eat. My cooler had some tortillas, cheese, and a bit of leftover chicken. I figured I'd make myself a quick quesadilla on the pan I'd packed. Simple, easy food, something warm to get the day started. I set the pan on the little burner and got the tortillas ready. The smell of cheese melting and chicken heating up spread through the camp. It was one of those smells that makes your stomach growl even when you're not hungry. I crouched by the pan, flipping the tortilla carefully so it browned without burning. That's when I noticed something odd. Just beyond my camp, through the trees, I thought I saw movement. It wasn't much, just a flicker of something pale against the darker trunks. At first, I thought it was sunlight hitting a branch or maybe a bird cutting through the trees. I stood up, squinting into the forest, but whatever it was had already slipped away. The woods went still again. I sat back down and tried to shake it off. It's easy to spook yourself when you're out there alone. Every little sound feels bigger. Every shadow seems to move. I told myself it was nothing and focused on finishing breakfast. The quesadilla came out just right, crisp edges with the cheese gooey inside. I ate it fast, enjoying the warmth against the cool air. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Even as I packed things up and got ready to hike a little deeper into the woods for the day, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The trees looked the same in every direction. Tall, thin trunks with patches of undergrowth, but I couldn't shake the idea that someone was back there, staying just out of sight. I walked for a while, following a narrow deer trail that wound deeper into the forest. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear footsteps or voices. Just birds and the occasional snap of a branch under my own weight. After a couple of hours, I circled back toward camp. I figured I was just letting my imagination run away with me. When I got back, though, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Everything was still there: tent, cooler, stove, but the order of things seemed slightly different. The cooler had been shifted a little, not much, just enough that I noticed it. The pan I'd left on top of it was now sitting on the ground. My backpack looked like it had been nudged to the side. None of it screamed danger, but it was enough to make my stomach knot. I crouched by the cooler and opened it. Everything was still inside. The remaining tortillas, cheese, a couple bottles of water. Nothing was missing, at least not that I could tell. But the fact that someone, or something, had been in my camp while I was gone made me uneasy. That night, I built a fire again. The flames crackled, and sparks floated up into the dark sky. I tried to focus on the sound, on the comfort of the light, but I couldn't stop scanning the edges of the woods. My eyes kept searching for that flicker of movement I'd seen earlier. I heated up another quesadilla for dinner, the same simple meal as breakfast. As I ate, I thought about the way the cooler had been shifted. If it was an animal, why hadn't it taken anything? If it was a person, why just move things slightly and leave them behind? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. At some point, I turned in for the night. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle outside the tent made me tense up. I lay there with my ears straining against the silence, my heart beating faster at every sound. Hours seemed to crawl by before I finally drifted off. When I woke, The air inside the tent was damp with condensation. I sat up and unzipped the flap, expecting the same quiet forest. Instead, I froze. On the little camping table I had set up near the fire pit, there was a tortilla folded in half. It looked just like the ones I had made the day before, except this one was raw, just cheese between two cold tortillas. It wasn't mine. I hadn't made it. I hadn't left it there. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been in my camp again, not just shifting things around this time, but deliberately preparing food, copying exactly what I had done. Whoever it was had done it while I slept, only a few feet away from where I lay in my tent. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed everything up in a rush, shoving my gear into the backpack without bothering to fold or organize. My hands shook as I broke down the tent. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every sound made me flinch, and every patch of shadows looked like it was hiding someone. By the time I reached the road, my shirt was damp with sweat, and my legs ached from moving so fast. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, just breathing. I kept thinking about that cold quesadilla sitting on my table, about how close someone must have been to me while I slept. The idea of it made my skin crawl. I never went back to that spot. I don't even like cooking quesadillas anymore. The smell of melting cheese in a tortilla, something that once made me think of comfort and simplicity, now takes me right back to that morning. It reminds me of waking up in the woods and realizing I wasn't alone, that someone had been close enough to watch me, to mimic me, to leave behind something that felt like both a warning and a message. That camping trip was supposed to be about peace and quiet, but it ended with me realizing something far worse, that the most unsettling thing in the woods isn't the dark or the animals. It's the thought that someone could be out there, silent, careful, watching every move you make, and you wouldn't even know until they wanted you to.